Namaste, and I welcome all my viewers to this second session of the final day of the Jaipur Dialogue Summit 2020. And we have a power packed panel today for a very important topic, a very important practical topic, how to build an ecosystem. This session is sponsored by Srimani and Krishna Bhagwan Gandham. And let's go straight into it, and let me introduce our power pack panel that we have today. Welcome Shri Vajant J. Panda. He is the Vice President of the Bharatiya Janata Party and ex-member of Parliament of both the Lok Sabha as well as the Rajya Sabha. Then I have J. Sai Deepak, a familiar face for the viewers of Jaipur Dialogues, and also very much into building our ecosystem. That's why he's here. In fact, when we requested him over to Jaipur Dialogues, we had a number of panels laid out for him, but he preferred this one. Kapil Mishra ji has just started an initiative to build an ecosystem. So let's go straight into this topic. We will have Vajant ji going first. And my question to him is that the leftist ecosystem, as we know, it punches far above its weight. Actually, it's probably a 10 kg boxer, which fights in the 150 kg category and is often able to overpower that 100 kg boxer. So punches far, far, far above its weight, and it's all because of the ecosystem. One of the leading thinkers of the RSS, actually, H.B. Seshadri ji, he was discussing the nationalistic behavior, the patterns of nationalistic behavior. He said the nationalistic behavior is categorized by, he said, acquiescence, assent, cajolery, concessions, self-reproach, and surrender. He was talking, of course, in the context of the 1947 and the issues, pre-partition issues vis-a-vis the Muslim League. But at least it is my personal perception that little has changed. So in the context of this, do we require to build an ecosystem? If yes, how? Shri Panda.
Namaskar. Thank you for having me at this session. This is a topic that is very relevant and topical at the same time. And let me say the following things in the next 7 or 8 minutes. One is, you're right about the ability of the left ecosystem to amplify its message. Leftists themselves may not have that much widespread support, nor be in government, but the ecosystem, you are right, is dominated by them and amplifies their message. So the question of should there be an alternate ecosystem, if so, how, is very, very relevant. I want to talk a little bit about how this ecosystem works, not just in India, but overseas. And I want to talk about how that ecosystem has been built. And then I want to talk about what are some of the legitimate ways of replicating that system with our thought process, our ideology, and what are some of the tactics that the left have deployed that we ought not to replicate, and why. So it's a fact that the leftist ecosystem has built up over decades globally, not just in India. Now, this after leftist ideologies have failed in country after country after country after country. Whether you take the USSR, or you take Cuba or Venezuela, or in China, which is today leftist in name and has some of those control systems, but they operate on market economics. And yet the leftist ideology has a charm. Many youngsters still say Lal Salam without realizing that that is the ideology that has killed tens of millions of people through brutal repression, maybe 100 million people. And that is because of the ecosystem. Now, one of the best books I have read on this is documents this. It's a contemporary book, only about 2 or 3 years old. I highly recommend this. It's called The Madness of the Crowds by Douglas Murray. He was editor of the Spectator magazine, and he has documented how, mostly in the West, in the US and in UK, little bit in India, about how the leftists have created their ecosystem with the dominance in academia, with dominance in media. And you can hear the same things in India. If you talk to young journalists in many media rooms, if they do not acquiesce and abide by the leftist cabals, ideas about what to promote, what to attack, then they get shunned out. They don't get coverage, they don't get bylines. And that is how the cabal in the media has grown. Now, similarly, in academia, Douglas Murray gives a very interesting statistic. Traditionally, the leftist dominance in US academia used to be a little more than 50%, in the range of 60% or so. And even as late as the 1990s, it used to be only about 2/3 of them were leftists and the rest were not leftist. I'm talking about professors, lecturers, etc. But in the last 25 or 30 years, well over 90% of all academics self-describe them as leftists. And if you take out the sciences and technology, in the liberal arts and humanities, about 99% of academics self-describe themselves as leftists. And you can see the same thing in India as well. As I said, more so in the liberal arts colleges rather than in the technological. So this is what helps them amplify the message. Now, of course, it is important to have an ecosystem which reflects alternative points of view, and the point of view that many of us subscribe to, which is center-right, more to the right, conservative, which gives due importance to both our traditions and history, as well as to science and progress and a modern outlook. Now, as I said, there are legitimate ways of doing it, and there are ways of doing it which would not be smart. So it is completely legitimate to promote those platforms and those people who support our viewpoint. That is part of free speech. That is part of our own Indian tradition of supporting ideas that we like. And so if I were to say something and the three of you were to amplify it, it's legitimate. Or if Sai Deepak were to make one of his important comments explaining the constitutionality of certain stands we have taken, if the rest of us were to amplify it, perfectly legitimate. It is legitimate for us to promote certain platforms and magazines and social media handles or our own ecosystem handles. Namo app, for instance, or there is a news platform called Rhythm, which collates news. Now, if you're going to use Daily Hunt, there is nothing wrong in using Rhythm. So these are legitimate ways of doing things. It is also legitimate to promote people of who are center-right in their thinking in academia and in institutions. Now, remember a few years ago, when at the Nehru Center, a very distinguished bureaucrat called Shakti Sinha was appointed, there was a furore by the lefts because they had come to believe that it was their like paternal property to misuse these institutions of state. And yet, Shri Sinha is one of the most distinguished civil servants, and just because he happened to subscribe to a different viewpoint should not make him, illegitimate to occupy that chair. Same thing goes for historians. We are well aware, it has been documented about how many historians have advanced the leftist cabal idea of India, which has a very slanted, limited scope, and blocks out many aspects of Indian history that is important for us to know. Not just Indian history, it is important for us to ensure that younger people, those who get excited by figures like Che Guevara because he was a revolutionary, should also get to read books like the Gulag Archipelago, which is Alexander Solzhenitsyn Nobel Prize winning documentation of the enormous depravities of the communist Soviet system, which killed 60 million people. So these academics and these youngsters who go around and saying Lal Salam, they ought to know the truth, and it is up to us to popularize not just classics but new writings about it. Before I come to an end, I want to point out that it is not smart and it is not correct to copy everything that the leftist ecosystem has done. because that has its own self-limitations. So, as I said, it's absolutely correct to promote people of our viewpoint. But let's take the media, for instance. So, in the media, at least in the West, there used to be a norm that prevailed for a long, long time, that news and views are different. So, when I studied in the US in the 80s and I lived there in the 90s, even left of center platforms like the New York Times would, in the news, try to have some degree of balance, try to report facts, try to report different analysis. In their editorials, they would spout their left of center viewpoint. Now, that has gone wrong. In the last 2 odd decades, you must have seen the recent controversies at the New York Times. If they try to print any center-right viewpoint, those people are getting sacked. They are being forced to resign because of that cabal, because of that peer pressure. And as a result, there is no distinction between their newsroom and their editorials. So the editorials were left of center, but even news is completely one-sided. And as a result, they have lost the credibility. And it's not just New York Times; it's CNN and others. If you look at and do research, you will find out how slanted their news reporting has become, that they don't have credibility with the masses. Now, if we were to ape that, if we were to copy that, if we also try to distort news, we may have some initial success for a few years, but ultimately we would also lose the credibility. That if we try to distort falsehoods as truth, you can succeed for a while, but not forever. So we should promote personalities that think like us in the media, and we should ensure that our opinions and their opinions get magnified, and it helps to influence and shape the general public's ideas. But we should never fall into the hubris of thinking that we can say black is white and white is black, and the millions of masses out there will forever believe us and will never question us. That will never happen. And we have actually facts on our side. We have truth on our side. So, as I said, I was trying to distinguish between the various kinds of legitimate ways of building our ecosystem and various ways that may be tempting, but perhaps not such a great idea to simply copy the left ecosystem. So in about 8 or 9 minutes, I've covered as much as I thought was relevant for the opening. Of course, there are many other aspects, and in the follow-up, I'll be happy to take questions and try to put more light on it.
Thank you very much. That was beautifully and very succinctly put. Now, I pose the same question to Sai Deepak.
So, first of all, Sanjayji, thank you for making me a part of this brilliant panel. I'm very, very grateful to you for hosting such an important discussion, because the word ecosystem, I suspect, has become a buzzword largely for the last 5 to 6 years at the very least. And therefore, we must try and understand what is it that we mean by an ecosystem in the first place. And second, I agree with a lot of things that Sri Panda just mentioned. And I just want to add a couple of points to that. So let me start with that in the first place. I'm sure everybody on this panel and others are aware of the fact that the left and right are words and terms that have been imported largely from the French Revolution. And those who opposed the traditional system, so to speak, or the ancient monarchy, so to speak, were the ones who were called members of the left. And the ones who supported the existing regime or the traditional regime were called members of the right. So that way you have largely the conservative being pitted on the right, so to speak. The one thing that I've realized, thanks to my exposure to some people who forced me to read some of the literature which I wouldn't have read otherwise and which I was not otherwise aware of, I've realized that what we see as the left today has become a big tent of sorts, largely for Marxist views, and therefore today the left is no more the left, but represents the Marxist appropriation and co-option of the leftist point of view. Okay, that's one. And this is not just in Bharat, but in other parts of the world as well. And even when it comes to Bharat, the equation of the left entirely with Marxism represents the utter corruption of the left itself and its complete co-option by Marxist elements. Now, whether left and right apply to Bharat in the first place is a different issue. But to the extent that they apply, the left in India has allowed itself to be completely taken over by Marxism, evangelical elements, and let's say candidly, even the jihadi elements, so to speak. So the left has more the appropriation of its own ecosystem than the non-left worrying about the absence of an ecosystem, because the non-left has managed to produce a lot of independent voices without the support of, let's say, a Nehruvian kind of establishment behind it. Therefore, I think it speaks volumes about the strength and the conviction of members of the non-left who have managed to create such disruptive narratives, in the sense that they have managed to create a disruption in the continuity enjoyed by the left of the last 70 years, thanks largely to their own single-handed efforts, and coupled with a fantastic willing audience, which has proved that there is a clear demand for this kind of a point of view. There is a clear dearth of this point of view, and there are people who are willing to consume this particular point of view, because they know that the articulation of this point of view is absolutely important for our own civilizational existence, so to speak, in the coming years. So one, the absence of a coordinated ecosystem, according to me, is going to be more organic with the non-left. This is not to say that we don't need coordinated efforts. Of course, it's absolutely important. But the great point of, or let's say the advantage of something coming up organically, where independent voices start coalescing and start collaborating with each other, is that they will never surrender their integrity and their principled positions at the altar of any other expedient requirement. And therefore, they will continue to bat for what they fundamentally believe in principle, and will not sacrifice that particular point of view at the altar of political expediency, which I think has happened with the left significantly. Okay, so according to me, there are quite a few things that we need to learn from the left's way of organization, from the left's way of, let's say, grooming people, which is largely because Abrahamic systems have supported the left, and therefore the organized nature of Abrahamic faith systems has effectively lent itself to the grooming of the left ecosystem in this country. Which is why there is not too much of a difference between the organized network nature of organized monotheistic faiths and the manner in which the left works, at least in Bharat. I don't know about other places, I can't comment on it, but at least as far as Bharat is concerned, thanks to the support behind the scenes of certain, let's say, non-civilizational, ontological, and epistemological systems, the left has managed to benefit from that particular structure in Bharat. That's point number one. Second, therefore, how is it that we respond to it? One, we have to realize quite a few things. There's a decent chance that the left in Bharat may be a monolith significantly, but the left outside Bharat is not a monolith. Therefore, you will find a lot of voices in the left in the United States who may agree with you more than the left in Bharat. Okay? Because they have understood the impact of colonizing, evangelizing faith systems and, let's say, market systems and systems on indigenous communities in countries and continents like the Americas, which is the North, as well as the South, the Caribbean, and Africa. Therefore, if you were to pitch your narrative properly, and if you were to present the facts properly, the chances are that the Indian left can be significantly isolated and exposed in the eyes of the global left, provided you do your homework properly and explain what the issue is. But so long as you continue to see yourself as part of the right, and you start pitching your case along with the right in the US or the right in the UK, frankly speaking, we will fail for multiple reasons, because people like Douglas Murray and others, notwithstanding the fact that they may have fantastic arguments against the left, are all, for all practical purposes, are empire loyalists. They are supporters of the British colonial narrative for all practical purposes. So when someone speaks of Britishness and doesn't comment on the, let's say, the colonial past, like the British history or England's history, then I will be clearly suspect of what is it that his position is ultimately going to be with respect to my civilization. So while certain people present themselves as fantastic ammunitions and shoulders to fire bullets from for the purposes of targeting the left, on a standalone basis, our position may not be in sync with the position of people on the non-left in the United States as well as in UK. So what is the issue? The issue is, when we start approaching the issue of the question of ecosystem or the construction of a non-left ecosystem, The first point in my humble submission would be to break out of the colonial mindset, both on the left and the right, completely. Because the more you play by those rules of let's say the colonizer, which is either the left or the right, you will try to customize your views, but still within the rules of the game established by the colonizer. Okay, which is precisely why I've said this in our previous discussion, Sanjay ji, that there is a happy coincidence between the non-left or the right and the Indic side. But the Indic side is clearly much more in sync with the requirements of this particular country, this particular civilization, than those people, or let's say those members who call themselves members of the non-left or the right, because the non-left sees itself as the other of the left, whereas the Indic side doesn't see itself as the other of the left or the right, but an independent position altogether. Therefore, an ecosystem, if it is to be built, I don't think it's fundamentally a question of the skeletal structure, the organization, or the network, but what is it that forms the fundamental building block, the thought process that informs our side, so to speak. If the ecosystem, which is non-left in this country, continues to think on the lines of the conservative ecosystem in the United States and United Kingdom, it falls in the very same trap that it is trying to avoid, which is to say, it will fight the left, but see itself as part of the right, and it realize that it is sharing space with colonial supremacists and the white supremacists, both in United Kingdom and the United States. Therefore, if Bharat has to come out with its own version and if its own position on what is it that it wishes to protect, what is its civilizational vision, perhaps we may have to take, let's say with some seriousness, what is known as the branch of decolonial civilizational studies that's going on in Latin America, that's going on in Africa, and all these places, where they've clearly said that the decolonial school of thought is neither postmodern nor is it colonial, it is decolonial, which is to say that we recognize that certain points of view may have validity, but in limited spaces. Our point of view must be that we will be driven by values which are indigenous. We will be driven by cultures and mores and thought processes and ideas which have emanated from this land. As long as we stick to that particular position and that becomes the let's say the foundational building block of your thought process, everything else falls into place. Agar aapki mansha hi galat ho, and if it is ultimately crooked, or you have not been able to get that basic, let's say, thought process or you've not been able to get it straight, then the ecosystem or the so-called infrastructure that you set up around this particular thought will reflect the very same mistakes, will reinforce the very same mistakes, will reiterate and repeat the very same mistakes. Therefore, I think we are at a let's say a critical point of inflection in Bharat's civilizational discourse, where we have to ask ourselves, how do we wish to counter the left? What is the original point of view that we wish to bring about as far as Bharat is concerned, so that we break out of the straitjacket of the left and right and come out with a thought process which is Indic, which is Bharatiya, and which is, let's say, dharmic in nature. And therefore, how do we source our points of view and our positions from the concept of dharma itself? That may, I think, be a decent starting point. These are my humble views. I could be entirely wrong.
Well, I don't think you're entirely wrong. It is you're probably closer to being entirely right. और मैं जो अभी जैसा ही दीपक जी ने कहा है, मैं कपिल जी के पास आता हूँ और एक छोटी सी अगर पुस्तक आप देखें, अर्थशास्त्र जैसी पुस्तक चाणक्य ने लिखी थी, उसमें आप पाएंगे, जैसा साईं दीपक जी ने कहा, कि वो जो उसकी जो अर्थ जो पूरी तरह से, जिसको आप कहते हैं इकोनॉमी आज के दिन में, वो तो लगभग पूरी तरह से कैपिटलिस्टिक, लो टैक्सेशन, इस तरह की है। और साथ में उसके जो आज के जो हमारे जो वेलफेयर मेजर्स हैं, वो एक वेलफेयर की भी बात उतनी ही शिद्दत से, उतनी ही गंभीरता से करती है जितने आजकल के शायद लेफ्ट वाले करते हैं। तो मैं आपसे पूछूंगा, साईं दीपक जी ने एक बहुत अच्छा फ्रेमवर्क दिया है कि हम ना लेफ्ट हैं ना राइट हैं, हम इंडिक हैं, धार्मिक हैं। आप क्या कहते हैं? और आप भी एक इकोसिस्टम बनाने के प्रयास में लगे, मैंने देखा है आपके व्हाट्सएप ग्रुप पे, तो वो उसका क्या, आप उसकी दिशा क्या है?
नमस्कार संजय जी, सबसे पहले तो मैं बहुत आभार आपका व्यक्त करना चाहूँगा कि आपने जयपुर डायलॉग में ये विषय चुना है इकोसिस्टम का। और ये शायद वो इनविजिबल एलिफेंट है या विजिबल है, लेकिन हम लोग आंख में पट्टी बांध के देखना नहीं चाहते और बात नहीं करना चाहते। तो इस मुद्दे पे चर्चा करने के लिए आपका बहुत बहुत आभार। और आभार इसलिए भी कि आपने आज के इस सेशन में जय पांडा जी को, जय साई दीपक जी को बुलाया है और सुनना ही बहुत था, मुझे बोलने का अवसर दिया, यही बहुत बड़ी बात है, क्योंकि हम इनको सुनने के लिए ही सेशन में हम लोग सब लोग जुड़ते। तो बहुत आभार। मैं सबसे पहले ये कहना चाहता हूँ कि मेरे हिसाब से इकोसिस्टम है क्या, या जब हम इकोसिस्टम की बात कर रहे हैं तो हम किसको इकोसिस्टम कह रहे हैं। जब शाहरुख नाम का एक लड़का दिल्ली की सड़क पे पुलिस के ऊपर बंदूक तान के खड़ा होता है और रात को एनडीटीवी पे रवीश कुमार उसको कहता है कि अनुराग मिश्रा आया है, और उसी एनडीटीवी की रिपोर्ट को लेकर आम आदमी पार्टी और कांग्रेस के लोग सोशल मीडिया पे बोलते हैं कि अनुराग मिश्रा ने गोली चलाई, उसको मैं बोलता हूं वो इकोसिस्टम है, जो सरेआम आंखों में धूल झोंक के झूठ भी बेचने को तैयार है एक दूसरे का। जब भी कठुआ में जो जो दुर्भाग्यपूर्ण बलात्कार की और हत्या की घटना होती है, उसको सीधे सीधे दुर्गा मंदिर और हिंदू धर्म से जोड़कर मुंबई में बॉलीवुड के स्टार हाथ में प्ले कार्ड लेके खड़े हो जाते हैं और अपने हिंदू होने पे शेम व्यक्त करने लग जाते हैं। वो इकोसिस्टम है। तो इस जब कोई आतंकवादी को सजा मिलती है, लेकिन एक वकीलों की टोली रात के 12 बजे कोर्ट खुलवाती है और कोर्ट खुलता भी है, तो वो इकोसिस्टम है। जब एक आदमी जिसके जो खुलेआम बोल रहा है कि ये सीआरपीएफ के जवानों को मारा तो अच्छा किया, नक्सलवादी जो लोगों को मार रहे हैं तो अच्छा कर रहे हैं, उसको जेल में है और उसके लिए वकील खड़े होते हैं कि कोर्ट में जाके कि इसको नानावती हॉस्पिटल में एडमिट कराया जाए, और टीवी पे टॉप जर्नलिस्ट आकर उसकी वकालत करते हैं। तो मीडिया भी बोल रहा है, जर्नलिस्ट भी बोल रहा है, वो जुडिशरी भी बोल रहा है, और सोशल मीडिया पे भी लोग बोल रहे हैं, और वो खुलेआम जो आदमी हमारे जवानों को मारने की बात कर रहा है उसका सपोर्ट तैयार किया जा रहा है। वो इकोसिस्टम है। ये इकोसिस्टम के खिलाफ हम लोग बात कर रहे हैं कि कैसे इसको हैंडल किया जाए और कैसे इससे लड़ा जाए। जहां पर बेंगलोर में वायलेंस होता है, दंगा होता है, लेकिन एनडीटीवी को ये मालूम होता है कि सुबह वो मस्जिद को घेर के हाथ पकड़ के जो 12 लड़के खड़े हैं उन्हीं का फोटो दिखाना है और वायलेंस का फोटो नहीं दिखाना। तो इवेंट एट द ग्राउंड जो किया जा रहा है, ग्राउंड पे मोबिलाइजेशन, उसके बाद इवेंट, और उसको कैसे मीडिया में दिखाना है और कैसे जुडिशरी में जस्टिफाई करना है। वायर ने अभी ताहिर हुसैन को एक्टिविस्ट की लिस्ट में ऐड किया है। जो ताहिर हुसैन ऑन कैमरा लोगों को मारता हुआ दिखा है, उसको एक्टिविस्ट की लिस्ट में वायर ने डाला है, और वो ग्लोबली अब उसी एक्टिविस्ट की लिस्ट को चर्चा करेंगे। तो ये इकोसिस्टम की हम लोग जब मेरे हिसाब से जब हम इकोसिस्टम की बात करते हैं तो इस चीज की बात करते हैं कि ये क्या है। तो मेरा ये मानना है कि ये ओवर द इयर्स बनाया है। 1970s में कभी कम्युनिस्टों का मैनिफेस्टो बना था कि कैसे ये यूनिवर्सिटीज में, अर्बन सेंटर्स में, जुडिशरी में अपने लोगों को बैठाना है, कैसे आदिवासी इलाकों में और गरीब इलाकों में जो असंतुष्टि है, डिसकंटेंट है, उसको मोबिलाइज करना है और हथियार देने हैं, और कैसे उनके फेवर में अर्बन सेंटर्स में अपने एक्सपर्ट बिठाने हैं, यूनिवर्सिटीज में बिठाने हैं, जुडिशरी में बिठाने हैं, मीडिया में बिठाने हैं। और कांग्रेस ने वो पूरा हैंड ओवर कर दिया, एक तरह से टेंडर दे दिया लेफ्ट को कि ये सरकार हम चलाएंगे और ये यूनिवर्सिटी और ये सब तुम चलाओगे। ये 30-40 साल में किया गया इस देश के अंदर। तो क्या हमारे देश में ये लेफ्ट और राइट की लड़ाई है? तो मैं एग्री नहीं करता कि ये कोई लेफ्ट और राइट की लड़ाई है। मुझे लगता है इंडिया में कोई लेफ्ट है ही नहीं, और एज सच कोई राइट भी नहीं है जो ब्रिटिश या अमेरिका के टर्म में देखा जाए तो। क्योंकि लेफ्ट का मतलब इंडिया में लेफ्टिस्ट आइडियोलॉजी हो तो, लेकिन एंटी नेशनल तो ना हो, एंटी धर्मा तो ना हो जाए। आप आतंकवादी, अभी फ्रांस का जो प्रेसिडेंट है, फ्रांस के प्रेसिडेंट जो इलेक्टेड है, वो लिबरल लेफ्ट आइडियोलॉजी से माने जाते हैं, लेकिन क्या वो टेररिज्म को बर्दाश्त कर रहे हैं? क्या बीहेडिंग को जस्टिफाई कर रहे हैं क्या? लेकिन इंडिया में जो लेफ्ट है वो यूनिक लेफ्ट है। वो पार्लियामेंट में भी अटैक हो जाए और मास बम ब्लास्ट हो जाए उसको भी जस्टिफाई कर देगा। वो कश्मीर में आतंकवादी पकड़ा जाए तो कैसे उसका कोई पिता कोई टीचर था, उसकी क्या बचपन में मासूमियत थी, उसका स्टोरी को प्रेजेंट करेगा। उसको क्या ट्रेडिशनल जो लेफ्ट राइट में बांटा जा सकता है, या सीधे धर्म और अधर्म इस दो कैटेगरी में बांटा है। हम किसी पर्टिकुलर टाइप की इकोनॉमिक मॉडल की बात तो नहीं कर रहे हैं, जब हम जिसको राइट विंग कहा जाता है भारत में, किसी पर्टिकुलर टाइप के गवर्नेंस मॉडल की बात भी नहीं कर रहे हैं। हम तो ये बात कर रहे हैं कि कोई हमें मारने आ रहा है तो उसको टेररिस्ट तो बोलो। मेरे को जिसने 1400 साल पहले, 1500 साल पहले, 500 साल पहले मारा है, वो मेरी हिस्ट्री में तो पढ़ाओ। तो हम तो अभी केवल फैक्ट्स की, सच की और झूठ की बात कर रहे हैं। आपको कैसा है लेफ्टिस्ट बेस्ड इकोनॉमिक या गवर्नेंस मॉडल प्रिफर है, उसका डिबेट कीजिए ना। आपको किस प्रकार का देश चलना चाहिए, उसका डिबेट कीजिए ना। लेकिन इस कंट्री का हिस्ट्री क्या है, वो थोड़ी झूठ पढ़ा दोगे आप हमको, कि मारने वाले के नाम को तो महान बता दोगे और मरने वाले को गलत बता दोगे। ये लेफ्ट राइट का लड़ाई नहीं है, ये सच और झूठ का लड़ाई है, ये धर्म और अधर्म का लड़ाई है। कश्मीर में अगर कश्मीर के अंदर वो कश्मीरी पंडितों को मार भी दिया गया और उनको निकाल भी दिया गया, घर से भी भगा दिया गया, जमीन पर भी कब्जा कर लिया गया, तो उसके बारे में बात करने का मतलब कोई राइट विंग या हिंदुत्व की बात नहीं हुआ, वो सत्य की बात हो रही है, वो धर्म की बात हो रही है। उनको उनको अगर न्याय मिलना चाहिए, इसकी बात की जा रही है, तो इसको लेफ्ट और राइट की लड़ाई में कैसे बांटेंगे हम लोग। तो मेरे को तो लगता है भारत में तो लेफ्टिस्ट नाम की कोई आइडियोलॉजी नहीं है। भारत में केवल वो एंटी नेशनल, एंटी हिंदू वो गैंग है। वो हमारे को दिवाली मनाने पे भी रोकेगा, वो सबरीमाला जाने पे भी रोकेगा, वो हमारे धर्म की हर प्रथा का विरोध करेगा, वो इतिहास भी झूठा बताएगा, मर्डरर को भी सही बताएगा, टेररिस्ट अटैक को भी जस्टिफाई करेगा, कोर्ट में भी खुलवाने के लिए जाएगा, मीडिया में भी सपोर्ट करेगा। तो उसकी क्या आइडियोलॉजी है, वो तो ये चाह रहा है कि कंट्री के और 10-20 टुकड़े हो जाएं और आपस में एक सिविल वॉर हो जाए, एनार्की की सिचुएशन क्रिएट हो जाए। इससे लड़ने के लिए बोलना पड़ेगा, उसके लड़ने के लिए सामने आना पड़ेगा। और ये पॉलिटिकल लड़ाई भी नहीं है, पॉलिटिकल तो जो बोल रहे हैं और बोलेंगे और करेंगे वो कर ही रहे हैं, लेकिन समाज की भी बात है। समाज को भी तो कहना पड़ेगा कि मेरा इतिहास तो सही बताओ, मेरा प्रेजेंट तो सही बताओ। 20 साल पहले कश्मीर में क्या हुआ, 50 साल पहले डायरेक्ट एक्शन डे के दिन क्या हुआ, लाहौर में क्या हुआ, ढाका में क्या हुआ, रावलपिंडी में क्या हुआ। हमारे बच्चों को अधिकार नहीं है क्या उसको पढ़ने का? लेट देम डिसाइड, लेट देम नो द फैक्ट्स एंड ट्रूथ एंड लेट देम डिसाइड कि कौन सा मॉडल इस देश में चलना चाहिए, उसका डिबेट कीजिए आप। इकोनॉमिक मॉडल का, गवर्नेंस मॉडल का डिबेट दैट, पर झूठ नहीं बोलिए और हत्यारों को महिमा मंडित मत कीजिए। इसकी अभी मेरे को लगता है कि ये उस इकोसिस्टम से हम लड़ने की बात कर रहे हैं जो अधर्म का इकोसिस्टम है, जो झूठ का इकोसिस्टम है। कैसे किया जाएगा, बिल्कुल कोई क्लू नहीं है, क्योंकि वो जिस प्रकार की पावर के साथ किया गया है, सरकार की पूरी ताकत लगी, दुनिया भर की इंटरनेशनल फंडिंग आई, बड़े बड़े एनजीओ के नाम पर लोग आ गए। अभी जिनेवा में अभी बी हेडिंग हुआ, वो ही जिनेवा में बैठकर कश्मीरी पंडितों को मारने को जस्टिफाई किया जाता था 30 साल से। अभी उनके दरवाजे पे हो रहा है वो, जिसको वो जस्टिफाई कर रहे थे और हमको ह्यूमन राइट सिखा रहे थे। तो ये कोई हमारा केवल घर का भी लड़ाई नहीं बचा है, पूरी दुनिया का लड़ाई है। मुझे ये लगता है कि कम से कम अभी जो मैंने एक टीम बनाई छोटी सी, जो इकोसिस्टम नाम रखा, तो ऐसा नहीं है कि वो टीम को इकोसिस्टम बना लेगी, लेकिन क्या सोचा कि कोई सोशल मीडिया पे सच लिखेगा और उसको घर से पुलिस उठा के ले जाएगी, तो उसकी मदद करने के लिए भी तो 4 लोग चाहिए। कोई किसी को झूठ में आतंकवादी बता देगा, उसके बाद उसका सर कलम कमलेश तिवारी को मार दिया, इधर दिल्ली में आदर्श नगर में राहुल को मार दिया, ध्रुव त्यागी को मार दिया, वो बेसोया लड़का, वो केवल अपने घर के सामने ड्रग की दुकान लगाने, मंडी लगाने से मना कर रहा था, वो गोली मार दिया दिल्ली में। लेकिन दिल्ली की सरकार जाके दादरी में जाके अखलाक के घर में 1 करोड़ रुपए दे के आती है, और इधर राहुल के घर में जाती भी नहीं मिलने के लिए। तो ये आइडियोलॉजी की लड़ाई थोड़ी है ना, ये राइट और लेफ्ट की लड़ाई है, ये तो जस्टिस की लड़ाई है, ये तो सत्य की लड़ाई है कि मेरी सरकार मेरे भाई को मारा तो पूछने नहीं आ रही, और दूसरे स्टेट में जाके वो रिलीजन देख रही है और कास्ट देख रही है, और जाके वहां पे जाके वो 1 करोड़ रुपए देके आ रही है टैक्स पेयर की मनी का। तो ये इस इकोसिस्टम से लड़ना है। और ये जो जिसको मार दिया, इसके परिवार को संभालने के लिए 4 आदमी तो खड़े होंगे। ये इकोसिस्टम तो हमको बनाना पड़ेगा। कोई झूठी खबर दिखाएगा तो उसको हमारे पे टीवी चैनल नहीं है तो सोशल मीडिया पे आके तो बताएंगे ना कि यार ये झूठ, विकिपीडिया पे झूठा, दिल्ली रॉयट्स की पूरी हिस्ट्री विकिपीडिया पे झूठ लिखी हुई है और वो एडिट भी नहीं करने दे रहा। तो उसको ठीक करने के लिए टेक्नोलॉजी जानने वाले और फैक्ट जानने वाले 4 लोग आपस में टीम बनाए और कहीं पर तो सच लिख के कि किसी को सच भी ढूंढना हो तो ढूंढता हुआ आ जाए, वैसा इकोसिस्टम मुझे लगता है बहुत बेसिक स्टेप्स लेने की अभी तो हमारे को जरूरत है, क्योंकि हम अभी आइडियोलॉजी की लड़ाई नहीं लड़ रहे, हम अभी अस्तित्व की लड़ाई लड़ रहे हैं, सर्वाइवल की लड़ाई लड़ रहे हैं। वी विल थिंक अबाउट आइडियोलॉजी, राइट होगा, लेफ्ट होगा, इकोनॉमिक मॉडल कौन सा होगा, लिबरलाइजेशन होना चाहिए, नहीं होना चाहिए, सरकारी कंट्रोल कितना होना चाहिए, वी विल थिंक अबाउट इट ओनली व्हेन वी विल सर्वाइव। अभी तो हमारे सर्वाइवल का लड़ाई है, बचने का लड़ाई है, बचेंगे तो आगे की कोई सोचेंगे। तो वो एक छोटा सा इकट्ठा हो जाए, हाथ पकड़ लें एक दूसरे का, मदद कर दें, कोई लॉयर है तो कानून की मदद कर दे, कोई टेक्नोलॉजी वाला है तो सोशल मीडिया पे मदद कर दे, कुछ वेबसाइट पोर्टल बनाने की मदद कर दे, कोई अच्छा बोल सकता है तो वीडियो अच्छे बना के सच बताना शुरू कर दे। तो सत्य और असत्य, धर्म और अधर्म, मुझे लगता है अभी हम अपने देश में अभी उस बेसिक लड़ाई में है, और अगर उसको पार पा जाएंगे तो हम लोग आइडियोलॉजी की लड़ाई भी लड़ पाएंगे। अदरवाइज पाकिस्तान में कोई आइडियोलॉजी नहीं बची, ईरान, इराक में, सीरिया में, अफगानिस्तान में, उधर कहीं कोई आइडियोलॉजी की लड़ाई नहीं बची, वहीं कहीं जाके हम लोग मजबूरी में मरते मरते खड़े हो जाएंगे। तो मेरा ये मानना है कि नीड ऑफ द आवर है, उसको इकोसिस्टम बोलो, उसको एक दूसरे का मदद करना बोलो, टीम बिल्डिंग बोलो, कुछ भी बोलो, पर हाथ पकड़ने का जरूरत है, साथ में आने का जरूरत है, एक दूसरे की मदद करने की जरूरत है, और सत्य के लिए, धर्म के लिए बोलने की जरूरत है खुलकर।
बहुत खूब Kapil ji. I go back to Mr. Panda. There are two very important viewpoints that have emerged out of this discussion. One is from Sai Deepak, who says that, okay, we should not stereotype any ecosystem as left or right, in the Indian context at least. And Kapil Mishra ji says that right now, whatever the ecosystem that we are talking about, is basically an ecosystem for our very survival. Sir, we come to you for your reactions.
Both are extremely important and deep-seated issues that we need to deal with. First, I of course agree with Sai Deepak when he says that in our own ethos, it is the Indic ecosystem that we are really talking about. But I digress a little bit in another aspect of what he had pointed out. I think despite the fact that our Indic ecosystem is neither left nor right by the Western international definitions, the fact is we can't ignore that. And I'll explain to you why. The reality is, in the international global context, what is left and what is right has evolved quite a lot over the decades and the centuries. It is not what was first defined by Edmund Burke and the others, as well as the French Revolution, as he pointed out. So just go back 100 years. The left was anti-religion. The communist revolutions were all anti-religion. But today, the left is clearly in cahoots with jihadis. And this is what is documented in Douglas Murray's book in great detail. This is extremely important for us to recognize that it is pro-one religion. And you see its manifestation in organizations like Amnesty, Greenpeace, who have been exposed coordinating and supporting terrorists and jihadis. Similarly, the right itself has also evolved internationally. It is no longer just that colonial empirical construct that is the classical understanding of the right. The right itself on social issues internationally is much more liberal today than it used to be even 30 or 40 years ago. And the right, I disagree that the right is a white supremacist kind of movement in international terms. Yes, there are fringe elements of the right at the extreme fringe who may be that. But if we look at, although our Indic system is neither left nor right, we will find a bit more in common. You consider them as overlapping Venn diagrams. We will find a little bit more in common with the global right than with the global left. And again, I reiterate that it is our own ecosystem that we have to develop. But we can't ignore the global left or the global right. The global left is a powerhouse today because it has this insidious network across continents, across countries. And it has this power that if we just say, look, we've got nothing to do with you, we are building our own system, we are dealing with a huge tentacles of the left everywhere else. And neither, of course, can we simply say that we are completely in sync with the global right. We are not. I would again reiterate, it's more like Venn diagrams. So I think Kapilji hit it exactly right. what matters when we look at these contrasts of global left and right is how it impacts us. So in India, it's very clear that it is the global leftists who are fomenting sedition, who are fomenting revolution, who are fomenting, and they are hand in glove with many who are proselytizing. Now, this is the irony. In global terms, it is the right which is considered as more conservative, religious, and into proselytization. But in India, you will see left who is hand in glove with proselytizers in certain areas. As you have Maoists with them, you have jihadists with them. It's a very strange combination of bedfellows. So finally, I would say this. Yes, of course, we have to build our own ecosystem of our own Indic beliefs, which is resilient. But we can't ignore the global left and right construct, because that is the power and the resources that we are experiencing, whether we like it or not. So we have to encourage our Indic system to speak out that, look, we have the same issue of political correctness. Internationally, the right is against political correctness, and the left insists on political correctness, that you can't call a jihadi a certain thing because it offends people. Now, we believe the opposite. We believe that they must be exposed, exactly what Kapil Mishra was just pointing out. So facts are facts that we must be very blunt about, very candid about. And in developing this ecosystem, I'll go back to my original comments that we must promote people that think, that are deeply committed to India, people that think, take pride in India's history, and at the same time are open to India growing and leading in the 21st century, openness to science, openness to taking a greater role at the global high table. And there is nothing wrong in promoting such people. As I said, we just have to be careful that we don't blindly ape. See, the dominant ecosystem globally is the left ecosystem. The dominant ecosystem is not the right. The right is often in government. Today, you have rightist governments in the UK and in many parts of Europe. And until just the recent US election, you had a rightist government in the US. But the ecosystem is not dominated by the right. You look at I gave you examples of media. I gave you examples of academia. If you look at social media, how some of the major social media platforms, they suppress global right-wing content and they promote left-wing and jihadi content. These issues are relevant to us. So we can't ignore the global left-oriented ecosystem, and we have to build our counter to it, keeping in mind what is happening on the international battlefield.
Thank you, sir. Okay, Sai Deepak, I just take a variation on this, and of course, there is only a little bit, though both agree that this has to be an Indic system, but whether you need more of right or more of left or what it is, of course, there's always that room for little difference of opinion. How important is state support for building an ecosystem, what we call Rajashraya in Hindi, and which has been the hallmark of most ecosystems, at least in India, if you look at it in terms of the civilization, and if you look at it in terms of the imperial occupation.
So I have tried to think about this question for quite some time now, because fostering an ecosystem seems to be on the top of everybody's minds, and rightly so. I don't think it's a wrong issue to be concerned about at all. But that would go back to one very fundamental question. What is it that we see as the role of the state? Rashtra ka kartavya kya hai? That's the basic question. Okay. Now, if you go back to the let's say European conceptions of the state, okay, Indian conception of what Europe believes is that the state must be aloof from religion and whatnot. That seems to be how we interpret European religion, or let's say European political institutions and ideas. But if you look at Western Europe, for that particular matter, which has been the predominant part of Europe that has influenced the rest of the world thanks to its colonizing tendencies, every European nation, or at least most of these European nations, have very specific religious identities which they don't shy away from. They may not speak about it often in public, but be it Sweden or Netherlands or Norway or United Kingdom, their churches, their monarchs, whether they are titular or whatever it may be, have very specific roles and specific identities which are Christian in nature, because the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648 was a Christian treaty and was formulated in the backdrop of religious wars of Europe. Okay, so every society in Europe has a very clear religious identity which they don't shy away from. Unfortunately or fortunately, Eastern Europe is much more conscious of its Christian identity because of it being part of the Byzantine Empire, whereas Western Europe, thanks to its secularization of Christian identity, has effectively given up its Christian identity because its own rules of multiculturalism are being used against it by the left and the jihadi elements. That is the sad reality of today. As far as Bharat is concerned, the first realization that I think Bharat must have is that it is a civilization state. And this is something that in 2012 and in 2015, Sri Konrad Elst wrote on fantastically on his blog, saying that Bharat has a better claim to being a civilizational state than even China because of its diversity, because of its scale, and because of its assimilatory nature. That's point number one. Point number two, if it is a civilizational state, a civilizational state's primary duty is to protect the identity of its civilization, which is perhaps my so-called English reformulation of what Kapil Mishra ji just said, that you protect your identity first. Okay, that's point number two. Point number three, if the protection of identity is important and it forms part of a civilizational state's duty, it is even more important in the Indian context because the state has supported an anti-civilization ecosystem for 70 years. Therefore, to undo that particular damage, you need state support. Why do you need state support? Because the state is the single biggest entity which is best positioned to create the multiplier effect. If you actually use the state as the medium to present a certain idea, it gets amplified at a national level. And in a country with the scale and the size and geography of Bharat, which is a subcontinent that masquerades as a country, it is impossible to hope to create a massive countrywide effect on issues relating to identity and consciousness unless there is state support. Most importantly, every attack and every insidious, let's say, issue that Bharat faces both from within and outside is a problem of identity and is a problem of consciousness. Dramatists personally outside of Bharat have a problem with Bharat's civilizational identity. People within Bharat, certain vested interests in Bharat who have enjoyed the support of the ecosystem for the last 70 years equally have a problem with Bharat's identity. Therefore, not in academic interest, but in terms of existential interest and for the purposes of its own survival, Bharat does not have the luxury of thinking about it. Bharat has the necessity to actually support every ecosystem that supports its civilizational point of view. Now, the problem is this doesn't translate to a license permit Raj of sorts. What does it translate to? The state's role must be to facilitate empowerment of civilizational centers of production of knowledge, let's say centers of production of identity and culture, which means those institutions which have been destroyed by the colonizer, which is to say the settler colonizer and the European colonizer, both of them, starting from, let's say, the 8th century onwards until 1947, all those institutions must be revived because those are the institutions which were identified as the nerve centers of your civilization, which is why they were targeted. Okay. Unfortunately, these centers of civilization, let me name them, temples are the subject of very clear dispute and debate because we have bought hook, line, and sinker the Europeans' representation of our institutions as fundamentally racist, casteist institutions. Since you have bought this particular history hook, line, and sinker, you will always be reluctant to revive those particular centers because you will be seen as fostering a Brahminical ecosystem. That will be the immediate allegation. Therefore, you wouldn't want to touch those institutions with a barge pole. Okay? So the state must play a role, but the state must play a role in giving each of these institutions the ability to stand up for themselves so that the society starts contributing to this particular building of an ecosystem from a bottom-up approach as opposed to a top-down approach. As long as the state performs this role, creates conditions which are conducive for, let's say, revival of these civilizational centers, I think, given the entrepreneurial spirit of Bharatiyas fundamentally, They are capable of, they have the brain to do what the rest of the world has done. If less than 23 million Jews can really create such an impact across the globe on a global stage at that particular canvas, I don't see why even 800 million Hindus can't do it. It's perfectly possible for us to do it. So I believe that this is the role of the state. Whatever may be the role of the state in its conception outside of Bharat, as long as we see it as a civilizational state, there is a civilizational obligation, and dare I say, that must be read into the fundamental duties, that must be read as part of constitutional duties as well. Therefore, I don't want to pitch a position where somebody says, your civilizational position seems to be at loggerheads with your constitutional mandate. No, I'm sorry to say, both are in sync with each other. The only problem is the lens through which you see the Constitution. I see the Constitution through a civilizational lens. You see it from perhaps a colonial lens. I can't help it.
राजाश्रय की क्या महत्ता है?
संजय जी, राजाश्रय तो खैर सरकारों को आश्रय तो शायद मिल सकता है, लेकिन राजाश्रय सिस्टम मुझे लगता है कि वो बेसिक बने किस प्रकार से हैं उसके आधार पे मुझे नहीं लगता कि बहुत ज्यादा कोई आश्रय मिल सकता है या मिलेगा। लेकिन इतना मिल जाए कि जो जंजीरें हाथों में बांधी हैं और पैरों में बांधी हैं वो छोड़ा दी जाएं, उससे ज्यादा आश्रय की आवश्यकता नहीं है। जैसा जैसा दीपक जी ने कहा, मंदिर छोड़ दो, हमारे सरकारी कंट्रोल से बाहर आ जाएं, तो सरकारी कोई राजाश्रय की आवश्यकता नहीं है। माइनॉरिटी के जो राइट्स डिफाइन किए गए हैं वो सेम राइट, इक्वल, कोई ऊपर नीचे नहीं, ज्यादा नहीं, इक्वल राइट दे दो, हमें राजाश्रय की कोई आवश्यकता नहीं है। लेकिन वो राइट लिमिट कर दिए जाएंगे, मंदिर चलाना मना कर दिया जाएगा, रिलीजियस एजुकेशन मना कर दिया जाएगा, और वो जो पूरा फ्रेमवर्क है कि ये तो एंटी हिंदू फ्रेमवर्क को लेकर ही कानून बनेंगे, सिस्टम बनाया जाएगा, तो वो जो जंजीरें बेड़ियां हैं, जंजीरें हैं, केवल उनसे छोड़ने की जरूरत है। उसके अदर कोई, जैसा लेफ्टिस्टों को पूरा कांग्रेस का सपोर्ट मिला या इस्लामिस्ट को जो सपोर्ट मिल रहा है, सरकार साथ में खड़ी होकर उनको 70 साल चलाया है, यूनिवर्सिटीज में बिठाया है, जजेस बनाया है, मीडिया हाउसेस चलवाया है, वैसा कोई सपोर्ट की जरूरत नहीं है, अपने आप सब कुछ कर लेंगे। वो जंजीर हाथ से छोड़ देनी चाहिए, इक्वल राइट दे दो, जितना राइट हिंदुस्तान में किसी भी और का डिफाइन है, कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन में डिफाइन है, ये वो माइनॉरिटी और मेजॉरिटी में डिवाइड ना करके इक्वल दिया जाए सबको। अपना रिलीजियस इंस्टीट्यूट चलाने का राइट है तो मेजॉरिटी को भी दे दो राइट चलाने का, एजुकेशन देने का राइट है तो मेजॉरिटी को भी दे दो, हमारा रिलीजियस इंस्टीट्यूशन फ्री करो गवर्नमेंट कंट्रोल से। इतना केवल बेसिक कि हमारे को, हम बराबर से दौड़ लेंगे और आगे भी दौड़ लेंगे, जो पैर के अंदर जंजीर वेट बांधा हुआ है वो छोड़ दो। हम ये नहीं कह रहे कि हमारे को अपनी गाड़ी में बैठा के चलाओ, तो राजाश्रय की आवश्यकता नहीं है, लेकिन तंत्र के हाथों, सिस्टम के हाथों जो सजा मिली हुई है, जो बांध के रखा गया है, वो छोड़ना जरूरी है, उतना फ्रीडम होना जरूरी है। बिल्कुल सही बोला है सही दीपक जी ने, वो उस चश्मे से जब तक आप हमारे को देखते रहोगे कि इन्होंने तो मारा ही होगा, इन्होंने तो अत्याचार किया ही होगा, क्योंकि यूरोप में हुआ, क्योंकि यूरोप में कोई पादरी अपने चर्च में बच्चों का बलात्कार करेगा या नन के साथ गलत संबंध बनाएगा या अत्याचार करेगा, तो उसका ये मतलब थोड़ी है कि आप उसको एप्लीकेट कर दोगे कि पुजारी भी यही करता होगा, और उसी फ्रेमवर्क को थोपते हुए आप हिस्ट्री भी लिखोगे, कानून भी बनाओगे, सिस्टम भी चलाओगे और अनटचेबल बना दोगे एक पर्टिकुलर सेक्शन को। वैसा करना छोड़ दें तो राजाश्रय की आवश्यकता नहीं है। राजाश्रय से कभी धर्म चला भी नहीं है, पहले भी कभी नहीं चला। धर्म से राज चलता है, राज से धर्म नहीं चलता। 1500 साल से तो राज के खिलाफ सरवाइव किया है हम लोगों ने, हमारे को खत्म कर देने वाली राज सत्ताएं थी 1500 साल तक, 47 तक मान लो, और अदरवाइज माना जाए तो 2014 तक धर्म के खिलाफ चलने वाले लोग सत्ता में बैठे हुए थे, धर्म को कुचलने वाले लोग सत्ता में बैठे हुए थे, मंदिरों को तोड़ने वाले लोगों ने राज किया, तो तब भी सिर्फ, तो हमें राजाश्रय की कोई आवश्यकता नहीं है, किसी भी तरह की राजाश्रय की आकांक्षा भी नहीं है। लेकिन ये इतना मानते हुए कि भाई आजाद देश है, अपना संविधान है और हमारा सिस्टम है, तो ये जो जंजीर बांधी हुई है ये छोड़ देनी चाहिए। इक्वल प्लेटफॉर्म, इक्वल राइट के साथ आप हमारे को जीने दो, हमारे को किसी आश्रय की आवश्यकता नहीं पड़ेगी। अपना एक दूसरे को, अभी जब पूरे खराब माहौल में बचा लिया 1500 साल, जब औरंगजेब के सामने बचा लिया और गौरी गजनवी के सामने बचा लिया, तो क्या कोई राजाश्रय के कारण तो बचाया नहीं था। तो मुझे ये लगता है कि जागृति का समय है। धर्म की तरफ झुकी हुई सरकारें सत्ता में आने लगी हैं, धर्मपरायण लोग राजनीति के निर्णय लेने लगे हैं। ये जनता ने किया है, बिना किसी राजाश्रय के किया है। मोदी जी को कोई राजाश्रय नहीं मिला, ये पूरा इकोसिस्टम उनके खिलाफ था। उनका बस चलता तो 2002 में ही जेल में डाल देते, 2003 भी ना देखने देते, 2014 तो बहुत दूर की बात है। तो बिना राजाश्रय के जनता ने, जागरूक जनता ने अपने आप को बना दिया। तो हमारे को राजाश्रय की आवश्यकता नहीं है, राजसत्ताओं को हमारी आवश्यकता ही पड़ेगी हमेशा। लेकिन इतनी आकांक्षा हमेशा रहेगी अपने संविधान से, अपने संविधान को चलाने वाले लोगों से, कि जो जंजीरें हमारे पैरों में बांध दी गई हैं, झूठा इंटरप्रिटेशन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन का करके जो राइट्स छीन लिए गए हैं, वो राइट बेसिक उतना वापस मिलना चाहिए, इतना मुझे लगता है।
से आपने अपना पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू आपने बहुत ही सुंदर आपने इसकी व्याख्या की है। सर, मिस्टर पांडा, यू हैव द लास्ट वर्ड, and after this we'll go to the Q&A round, and you heard both of them speak, and accordingly that they say that okay, that we have had a anti-civilizational state for 70 years, and all we ask for is removal of fetters. We do not even ask for favor of the state. Sir, your reaction?
मेरे दोनों सब पैनलिस्ट्स ने बहुत स्पष्ट रूप से ये अभी बात रखें कि किस तरह ये एक एंटी सिविलाइजेशनल स्टेट और एंटी इक्वालिटी पर सिस्टम चल रही थी पिछले 70 साल से। I completely agree with both these points, and I want to reinforce that by saying a couple of things. So I think Sai Deepak ji hit the nail on the head जब उन्होंने मंदिरों के बारे बात की। देखिए, the word secularism is very debated and controversial in India, but we must keep in mind that what is considered secularism in India is not considered secularism anywhere in the world, not even in the West. तो ये हमें समझना चाहिए, क्योंकि वेस्ट में कोई भी देश में सेक्युलरिज्म का मतलब ये नहीं होता है कि एक धर्म का the religious places of only one religion are controlled by government and rest are not. तो हमारी ये जो सेक्युलरिज्म है, मैं कोट अनकोट में बोलता हूँ, ये लेट 19th सेंचुरी में ब्रिटिश राज के समय किया गया। केवल हिंदू धर्म के मंदिरों को सरकारी कंट्रोल में रखा गया क्योंकि वो डेंजर महसूस करते थे मेजॉरिटी पॉपुलेशन से। So rest of the religious structures in India are managed by their own community, whether it is gurdwaras, whether it is churches, and that is how it should be. That is actually non-interference of state in religion. And if we say that our constitution is a secular constitution because that word was introduced in the 1970s, then that should mean that Hindus should have the right to manage their own religious places just like all the other religions do. So this is absolutely uncontroversial. We should assert it. So there is no conflict between constitutional propriety and a civilizational state, just as Sai Deepak ji was pointing out. So the reason I'm making this point is we cannot be an island. Even a nation of 1.3 billion people, we have to live in the larger world. And so that's why we have to be aware of these ecosystems, especially of the left, which is the dominant ecosystem around the world. And we must be clear about the language and the definitions that they use in tackling them, just like on this issue of secularism. और ये जो इक्वालिटी की बात कर रहे थे कपिल जी, ये देखिए, ये तो बिल्कुल स्पष्ट है कि संविधान का दुरुपयोग करके बहुत सारे ऐसे हमारे नीति बनाए गए जो बिल्कुल अनइक्वल है, जो बिल्कुल हिंदुइज्म के खिलाफ हैं, और they are not they don't believe in equality at all. So here also we must understand the language of the global right and the left. Recently we have seen a situation where they were trying to do a false equivalence that speech is equivalent to actual action. Somebody was organizing bombs, somebody was organizing attack mobs, and that is being equated to a speech. If you don't maintain law and order, people will come out on the streets. So this false equivalences, the left has a particular ability to misuse it and try to spin it against the Indic culture and instincts of India. Whereas if we understand what they are doing, we can expose it and point out that speech can never be as dangerous as actual, a mob out there with grenades and bombs and acid. So these are the points that we must point out. And there is absolutely nothing wrong in the constitution being in sync with a civilizational. Look, I'll end with giving this example. Not only is our constitution inscribed, the original version, with the Ramayana, think about Indonesia. It's an Islamic nation. They have no problem with recognizing the culture and the history, and their Ramayana is depicted everywhere. Garuda, Ganesh are depicted everywhere, including on their banknotes and so many. So we certainly should not have an issue that we are a constitutional democracy which takes pride in its culture and its heritage. There's nothing wrong in that at all.
All right, sir. On that note, I bring this discussion to an end. This session sponsored. Are you saying something, Deepak?
Just one point, sir. Just to add to what Mr. Panda said, and since he rightly hit the nail on the head, which is to say that secularism was introduced in 1976. If the state wants to hold on to Hindu temples, I have a controversial barter to propose. Remove the word secular from the constitution and hold on to our temples.
That's a great barter. I think that can be used as a talking point. Definitely.
Then formally we will not accept it's a Hindu state.
Yes, okay. So I was just mentioning this is session sponsored by Srimani and Krishna Bhagwan Gandham, and we bring this discussion to a close. And now we have a short question and answer round. We take questions. These are selected questions from the audience.
Press the bell icon on YouTube and don't miss another update.
So the first question that comes up on the screen, this is Kapil ji. Kapil ji, international schools under ICSE, Cambridge board do not cover Indian history in the UK made syllabus. Indian students are denied of knowing their own history. Why is government being a silent spectator to the same? A short answer, please.
Indian students are denying of knowing history in India also. तो यूके का क्या सवाल उठाएंगे हम लोग? अभी तो हमारे को अपना हिस्ट्री हमारे देश में नहीं पढ़ाया जाता। डेफिनेटली जिनका भी ये सवाल है बहुत ही सीरियस क्वेश्चन है। मैं ये रिक्वेस्ट करूंगा कि आप हम में से किसी को भी, संजय जी को, मेरे को, किसी को भी आप ये टैग करके ट्विटर पे या ईमेल पे अगर भेजते हैं तो हम 10, 20, 50 लोगों को यूके के उधर वहां लिखवा देंगे, ईमेल करेंगे, बोलेंगे। मुझे लगता है वहां चेंज होना आसान है, हमारे यहाँ चेंज होना थोड़ा ज्यादा मुश्किल है। तो हम तो मैं तो ये कोशिश होनी चाहिए कि हमें अपना सही हिस्ट्री बताया जाए। उधर अभी भी आई थिंक अच्छे से अगर बोला जाएगा, लोग जाकर बोलेंगे तो शायद उधर डेमोक्रेसी ज्यादा फंक्शनल है, वहां पर चेंज कराना फिर भी आसान रहेगा। दैट्स व्हाट आई बिलीव। पर जिनका भी ये क्वेश्चन है, यू कैन रीच आउट टू एनी ऑफ अस एंड वी विल मोबिलाइज पीपल, वी विल सी टू इट कि ये चेंज किया जाए वहां पर।
Okay, the next question goes to Sai Deepak. It's addressed to Sai Deepak. And does it make sense to have student unionism in a country like ours? We need to have them study and not use it for vandalism. Your views, please.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes. So I don't see any problem with student unionism because institutions and educational institutions are not meant to be aloof from politics at the end of the day. After all, campuses played a pivotal role in the revolutionary movement under the British. It was students and professors and teachers and whatnot who participated in it. The question is more of what brand of politics do you endorse, or are educational campuses being turned into primarily battlegrounds for politicians? That's the question. Politics being a part of student life is certainly acceptable, but the question is whether you convert the entirety of student life and make institutions the hubs of certain political parties or let's say political ideologies. That is where the problem begins. as long as there is no compromise on, let's say, the core responsibility and the core function that a university is expected to discharge or a campus is expected to discharge, I don't think there's a problem. The problem today is that even when the professor or, let's say, the vice chancellor of a university decides to bring about rules of discipline to ensure that there is a semblance of, let's say, education, there's a semblance of discipline on the campus, when political ideology is being used to question the fundamental role that a vice chancellor is supposed to perform in, let's say, in an institution like JNU, that is where clearly politics has trumped the purpose of the university, which is to dispense and impart education. There is where the compromise cannot be had. If education is not the primary role of the institution and it becomes a breeding ground for political ideologies and ultimately for anti-national political ideologies, I think that's where the problem is. Per se, I don't have a problem with either unionism or political activism on campuses.
Thank you. And the last question comes up. This is addressed to Shri Panda. We are seeking uniformity of secularism. Why don't we stop using this wrong word secularism and stop misleading further?
The question hits a very important point, that there is a lot of misleading going on in the name of secularism. Now, whether we agree with the Western concept of secularism or our Indian concept of acceptance of all different viewpoints is a different issue. The issue here is the word itself is being misused in the Indian context, and it is in the Constitution. So I want to make it a point. Now, we are committed to the Constitution of India, and we are committed to this Constitution being in sync with civilizational India, which is also a modern 21st century India. This is what we have been discussing in this period for the last 1 hour. Now, until and unless the constitutional terms are changed, we can't ignore the word secular. So if and when there is ever a consensus which leads to a change in that word in the Constitution, that's a different issue. And, people are entitled to try for it, to strive for it. But until that happens, we simply can't ignore that word. But we don't need to. As I was just talking earlier, as we have spoken, the hypocrisy with which the leftist cabal uses that word, which is a completely twisted version of what it means everywhere else in the world, must be exposed, so that even if the word is still there in the Constitution, it should not be allowed to be misused for a particular political agenda, which the left has been carrying out for all these decades. And the Constitution gives us enough rights to insist that there has to be equality, true equality, not this kind of twisted use of global words to go against our ethos, to go against our culture, to rewrite our history, to try to mislead and try to hold up as paragons of virtue people who have in history been known to be great butchers and great, unleashed great savagery in the country. We don't need to shy away from the truth. So we must insist on the whole truth being made available to all Indians, including warts and all the pluses and minuses, and then asserting our strength on the basis of logic, on the basis of pride in our culture, and on the basis of an open mind to a modern, prosperous, respected, and admired India, Bharat.
And just a short follow-up from my side. You're talking about the ecosystem and the both sides ecosystem. Now, they have built this edifice of false history books even through the government NCRT system. Will it require a big ecosystem, or will we also get the help of the state in correcting this history book now that the exercise of new education policy is on? Mr. Panda.
I think the state, of course, has a crucial role in helping to shape education. The state has to play a role. The cabal of Marxists, which have dominated the writing of our history, is not a new thing. It has been known for many decades, even pre-independence, and especially after independence. Now, there are private efforts going on. There are writers from our ecosystem who very lucidly, using the best historical research and using logic, have been writing and bringing to popular understanding Indian history. Sanjeev Sanyal, for instance, and many others like him. But it can't be just individual efforts. It just can't be our ecosystem. Ecosystem's job is to amplify, is to help reinforce. But to expect an ecosystem to create or replace the entire structure of our edifice is a bit unreasonable. So since the government does have a role in helping to shape education, we must demand, we the people must demand that the government undo the suppression of our history and make our entire history known to the people.
Sanjay ji, I would like to add one line here. हेलो
जी
या एक ये बड़ा मिसकॉन्सेप्शन है कि 6 साल में जो गवर्नमेंट है तो हिस्ट्री में कुछ चेंज ही नहीं किया गया है या कोई चीजें बदली नहीं है. आई थिंक पीपल नीड टू गो बैक एंड चेक व्हाट ऑल हैज चेंज्ड. मैं आपके जयपुर डायलॉग पर ही एक पेपर आपको शेयर करूंगा जो आप अपने फॉलोअर्स के साथ शेयर करना चाहते हैं. Thousands and thousands of pages have been removed or changed or altered in last 6 years. जरूरी नहीं है कि वो उसको ढोल बजा के किया जाए, but massive changes are happening. और जो झूठ पढ़ाया जा रहा था वो slowly लेकिन firmly वो हटाया जा रहा है हिस्ट्री की बुक से, और न्यू एजुकेशन पॉलिसी के साथ और ज्यादा चेंजेस वो होंगे, ऐसी एक्सपेक्टेशन है. लेकिन ये बोलना, क्योंकि ये कई बार बहुत लोग बोलते हैं कि कुछ हुआ ही नहीं, कुछ हुआ ही नहीं, कुछ हुआ ही नहीं, तो मुझे लगता है कि वो सच नहीं है. बहुत चीजें ऑलरेडी चेंज की जा चुकी हैं.
Thank you, Kapil ji. And on that note, on that happy note, we bring this episode to an end. I would like to thank you, all the speakers, especially Mr. Panda, who had to take time off from his very, very busy schedule, and to Sai Deepak, who's contributed immensely to this entire discourse, and his own activism in the Free Temple movement is quite remarkable. And Kapil ji, who has actually set up something that I saw that he wants to build an ecosystem. Thank you also very much. Also thanks to our sponsors, Shri Mani and Krishna Bhagwan Gandham. Thank you to all the viewers. Jai Hind, Vande Mataram.
Jai Hind, Dhanyavad.
Vande Mataram.
Vande.
Yeah.